Chapter 9. The Body. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. How often, during the long years in the labor camps, did I think of that scripture text, sometimes in a spirit of gentle irony, but mostly in the agony of piercing bodily pain or the despair of total exhaustion. And how often, during those years, did I think of how much the body means to man, how essential its well-being is to his well-being, how prominent a part in every activity of human existence is played by that clay into which God first breathed the breath of life. Man is a creature composed of body and soul. We have recited that truth from the day we first learned our catechism. But until the body fails us, or pains us, or forces itself upon our attention by some little twinge or complete collapse, we tend to take for granted this first and most precious of God's gifts to man, or to give it short shrift. My second day in the labor camps was one of those days. The first day was bad enough. I had been put to work shoveling coal in the hold of a ship. The pace was furious. All during the long winter months when the waters were frozen, coal was stored on the banks of the Yenisei River in the Arctic port of Dudenka. During the relatively short time each year when the ice melted and the river was navigable, all that coal had to be loaded on ships and moved out. So the prisoners at the Dudenka camps were driven without rest 12 to 15 hours a day in the long Arctic summer daylight. It was brutal work to begin with, but I had done no work at all for more than 5 years. I was physically in no condition to work. But I was marched down to the hold of the ship, given a shovel, and told to spread the coal as it came cascading down a conveyor belt so that it would be loaded evenly. I worked until I was ready to drop, which was rather soon because of my condition, and then had to go on working for fear of my life. There was no way I could stop the conveyor belt, and if I stopped shoveling, I would have been buried by the roaring coal. So I had to keep moving, stumbling and slipping over the shifting coal as the hold filled up, working the shovel as best I could, even after my arms and chest grew numb, and I had no sensation at all in the mechanical motions I made. When I collapsed on the plank bunk of the prison camp that night, every muscle and sinew in my arms and legs, my chest and back, felt completely unstrung. The morning of the second day, when the signal to rise rang out at 5 a.m., every muscle in my body had stiffened like twisted wrought iron. It was agony even to attempt to get up. The tiniest movement was like a scream of pain. Swinging my legs over the side of the bunk was torture. Standing up was a near impossibility. How would I ever march down to the ship, let alone shovel coal for another 15 hours straight? It couldn't be done. It was physically impossible. But I did it. That was my introduction to the Siberian labor camps. There was no gradual breaking in period. After almost 5 years of constant inactivity in prison, we arrived in the camp one afternoon and began a full day's work the next morning. From then on, unless totally incapacitated by illness or relieved by some other miracle, we worked with hardly a day off. It was the reason we had been sent to these particular camps in the far north. At the transfer camps along the route from Moscow, the sick and the fragile had been screened out. There were no humanitarian motives behind such medical exams, but a policy rather of the sheerest expediency. Siberia, the government had decreed, was to be industrialized. Work in that frozen country was a nightmare. Despite grand government promises and big bonuses, there were few volunteers. Manpower had to be supplied, and the prisoners provided it. It was not worthwhile, though, to transport and feed a prisoner unless he could work. If detention was the only purpose to be served, there were plenty of prisons where the sick and the weak and the exhausted could be detained. So those who were sent to the frozen wastes of Siberia were expected to work, and work we did. Living conditions in the camps were intolerable. The barracks provided just enough shelter from the piercing winds to make survival possible, nothing more. The food ration was just barely enough to sustain life and provide the energy needed to work. There was a guarantee ration, which was enough to keep you alive, but as an added incentive there were +1, +2, and +3 coupons for extra rations of food given to those who overfulfilled their quota of work each day. That incentive plan, deliberately or not, could work in reverse upon the prisoners physically. If you failed for several days to fulfill your quota, for example, and were given only the guarantee rations, the weaker you became and the harder it was to fulfill your quota the next day. It was a vicious circle. Yet men survived. That we survived under the circumstances is a tribute to the stubbornness and power of the human will, driving the body beyond what a man thought he could endure, and a tribute as well to the marvelous work of God's creation that is the human body. No machine ever devised by man could have withstood day in and day out the constant punishing grind of work in the severest kind of weather that the human body proved itself able to withstand in the Siberian slave labor camps. It is customary to speak of the indomitable human spirit as that which carries man through crises like this, but the body surely merits more attention than it usually gets. Not the trained, beautifully conditioned body of the athlete, but the weak, underfed, and ordinary body with which we are all endowed. It was under the daily regime of work to exhaustion in the camps, under the constant torture of hunger and cold, through hurt and pain, distress and disease, weariness beyond comprehension and endurance beyond belief, that I came truly to understand and appreciate the catechism truth that man is a creature composed of body and soul. There is a strain in Christian asceticism that tends to despise the body, that looks upon it as the corruptible part of man and the source of corruption. Because the soul is immortal and the body is corruptible, Eastern mystics especially tended to look upon the body as a dumb beast that must be beaten into submission like a stubborn ass. The spirit indeed is willing to serve God and seek perfection, but the flesh is weak, is lazy and slothful, is prone to concupiscence and sin, seeks its own pleasures, and distracts the soul from seeking God alone. So the early fathers of the Eastern desert, for example, sought to subdue the body by extravagant penances and excessive fasts in order to attain mastery over the weaknesses of the flesh, and so free the soul from any tendency to give in to the cravings of this sinful mortal nature. This tendency to look on human nature, especially so-called fallen human nature, as ignoble and debased, sinful and therefore contemptible, in constant need to be checked and controlled by the nobler part of man, has remained in some form or other a part of traditional Christian spirituality, and I think it is wrong. It is Gnosticism and Manichaeism, and Catharism and Albigensianism and Jansenism and every heretical tendency that sees matter as evil and the flesh as prone to evil. For whatever reason, it is always the poor old body that gets the worst of it, as if the mind and will never had any sinful thoughts or inclinations, as if sin did not consist precisely in setting one's will, not the body, against God's will. What came to me in the prison camps was a tremendous respect and love for the poor old body. It was the body that bore the brunt of all suffering, though the soul might well experience anguish, and it was the body that had to sustain you, for all the strength of will and determination a man might have. It was the body that felt the sting of the wind, the bite of the cold, the cramp of aching muscles, the raw lash of cracked and bleeding flesh, the gnawing agony of hunger in the belly, the soreness and numbness of overtaxed sinews, frostbite and stomach rumblings, swollen feet, running eyes, chapped lips and battered knuckles, sprains and cramps and aches and bruises. All these the body patiently endured through the long, long days of labor in the driving snow or freezing rain or spring muck of the far north. And yet somehow it always managed to get you through one more day. It was the body that underwent the suffering, felt the agony, and carried the heavy weight across its shoulders of this daily passion and slow death of inhuman work. I had always, in many ways, taken the body for granted. As a youth I had played at many sports and excelled in some, like baseball and boxing. I had been a scrapper. I had always wanted to outdo everyone, be the best, be the strongest. I could take punishment, and I could dish it out. During my early years in religious life, I had even tried to outdo the legends of the saints in fastings and penances of every sort. But I did it not so much to punish the body or attain perfection as to prove to the world and to myself how tough I was. Yet it was only now, when each day ended with exhaustion and the body cried out for every extra minute of rest, every little respite from work, every extra crumb of food, that I really came to appreciate the marvelous gift of life God had given man in the resources of the human body. The intimacy that exists between soul and body is a marvel of creation and a mystery of human existence. Yet we do wrong to think, because the soul will be judged after death while the body crumbles in the grave, that this mortal handful of dust is any less a gift of God, any less noble or beautiful than the immortal soul. It is in the body that we exist and work out our salvation. It is in the body that we see and take delight in the beauties of God's created universe, and in the body that we ourselves bear the marks of Christ's passion. The mysterious interplay of body and soul is an essential characteristic of our human nature. If the body is sick or sore, tired or hungry or otherwise distressed, it affects the spirit, affects our judgment, changes our personality. So slight a thing as a headache can affect our relations with those around us. It is through the body that we express and experience love and kindness and comfort. We excuse our snappish, petty, ill-mannered conduct to one another on the grounds that the body is having a bad day. We're constantly, day in and day out, hour after hour, under the influence of these mysterious workings of soul on body and body on soul. Theologians have written much about the incarnation as the central act of our redemption, the high point in the drama of salvation history. Spiritual writers can write endlessly about it, talking about redemption and salvific acts, about a new creation and the restructuring of the social order, about mankind being elevated and made once again whole and holy, about expiation and atonement and reconciliation of the fallen world with the divine will, about the new Adam and the kingdom of God and the life of the world to come. What we tend to forget, though, is the very folksy truth that God, by his incarnation, took on a human body. We don't often stop to reflect on the most basic meaning of this doctrine, that God, too, knows exactly how it feels to be cold, or tired, or hungry, or sore with pain, because he, too, has had a body. He has spent long hours for years at a time doing the routine and unspectacular work of a carpenter, has walked long days over dusty roads with tired feet, has curled his shoulders against the night air or a chill rain, has been without sleep while others slept, has been thirsty and hot and weary and ready to drop from exhaustion. Christ must have known what it is like to wake up stiff and sore on a dull gray morning, must have had headaches and toothaches and backaches and aching bones, must have been anxious and annoyed and irritated at times. In the incarnation, God came to know for himself what a thing is the life of man, what a work of his hands is this creature composed of body and soul. From the dark of the womb to the black of the tomb, through childhood to manhood and the last slow, long drawn-out agony of dying, he has known for himself what it means to live in a handful of clay, to feel the cool touch of mother's hand on fevered flesh, to taste the salt of sweat and tears, to hear music and birdsong and the vilest of insults, to stumble and fall, be bruised and mangled and torn. He cried out at last, as have all of us at one time or another, to be spared any more burdens or suffering. The incarnation, in short, meant that God became man, like us in all things, says St. Paul, except sin. Through it all, did God find that the body of man was good, as he had pronounced it in the first days of creation? I think so. And through it he achieved our redemption. By redeeming us, he did not thereby free us from our suffering or our pains or our sorrows. Just as his resurrection is our victory and our triumph over death, but does not mean that we do not have to die, so his passion has redeemed our suffering, but does not mean we do not have to suffer or feel pain. Yet his example has taught us how to look upon our suffering in a new way, and so to look upon our body in a new light. Redemption, salvation for every individual, consists in doing the will of God, no more and no less. Father, said Christ at the moment of his supreme agony in the garden, not my will, but thine be done. Yet God will not, has not, asked us to bear any more than he himself has borne in his incarnation and suffering and death, nor to experience anything he himself did not experience. For each of us, salvation means no more and no less than taking up daily the same cross of Christ, accepting each day what it brings as the will of God, offering back to God each morning all the joys, works, and sufferings of that day. But those are abstract words. What it means in practice is spelled out as always by the poor old body. It means getting up each morning and going to bed exhausted. It means the routine, not the spectacular. It can mean drudgery, pain, putting aside pleasures, happiness, or the love the human heart craves until another time, so that what is necessary at the moment can be done. It means working for others, touching the lives of others through the medium of the body. How many times, tired and worn out and near collapse from the slave labor conditions of the camps, did I think I could not ask another step of the body? Did I think in pain and irony of those words, "The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak"? Truly, man is a creature composed of body and soul, and we work out our salvation in this vale of tears through the medium of the flesh. It is the first gift God and our parents fashioned for us. It sustains and supports us through a long life and makes possible both joys and sorrows. And when at last we are parted from it in death, it surely deserves whatever rest it can get before it rises to be glorified at the last judgment.